Y'all didn't think I'd do it, but I did it because here we are. The last party pack until we're finally caught up. Jackbox 8. Jackbox 8 is right up there with 4 as being one of the most controversial packs. There's a lot of people that don't like this one. It doesn't help that, much like 4, it was a follow-up to one of the highest acclaimed entries. But I think 8 has a lot more going for it than people often give it credit for. There's a new consistent and nicely organized options menu that was carried over to pack 9 and will likely be used for pack 10. And pack 8 has 3 games that support up to 10 players. I mean, that's a big deal. I often play in pretty big groups over Discord and will frequently pull out pack 8 as a result of said big groups. After all, this is the first party pack where all 5 games support a minimum of at least 8 players. So if you're like me and find yourself often playing in sizey groups of people, 8 might be worth looking into for that fact alone. But of course, none of that matters if the games are no good. So let's take a look into our first game, Drawful Animate. Standing in as our sequel of pack 8, Animate is of course the successor to Drawful's 1 and 2. The game where you're told to draw a thing, usually something so outlandish, half the players will audibly go, "How the hell am I supposed to draw this?" Your drawing is then shown to everyone else. Your friends all guess what they think your prompt could have been. All those answers get thrown up on the screen alongside the real prompt. And the idea is that, as the artist, you want people to guess your prompt since that's how you score points. But as the guesser, you want others to guess your fake prompt because that's how you get points. As always, the player with the highest score being the winner. It's a great formula that hasn't changed since the first Drawful and creates for an experience that is both funny and strategic. The gimmick with Animate, as its namesake would imply, is instead of doing a single static image, you are now drawing 2 frames to create a dinky little animation, complete with onion skin so you can see what you drew on the other frame. The animation gimmick is what both breaks and makes this iteration of Drawful. At launch, I was pretty hard on this feature since most of the prompts don't contain verbs or actions that would justify a second frame, and instead is mostly stuff you could do in a single picture. It results in an experience that essentially takes twice as long, and long really is the key word here. A full 10-player game of Drawful Animate takes over half an hour to complete, and again, at launch, I wrote it off for that. While that specific criticism is one I still hold, I don't know. Drawful Animate is a game that really grew on me over time. A big part of that is that animation is just fun, and when it's presented in this 2-frame format, it's easily digestible, easy to approach, and doesn't feel like work. Really, a lot of times when I play this, I don't even care about winning. It's just fun to make amateurish little 2-frame animations with your friends. But there are some other additions and changes that have been made since Drawful 2. First of all, 10-player cap of an audience feature supporting up to 10,000 more. The audience feature is basically what you'd expect. Audience members can play along voting on what they think the real answer is, even providing points to the in-game players if they vote for their lie. But it's that 10-player cap that had me revisiting Animate despite my initial thoughts. While there still isn't an undo button, which is particularly insulting since you're making animations now, everyone now gets 3 colors, with one of them always being black. There's a new double down feature that provides twice as many points if you get the prompt correct, but gives the writer of a fake prompt double points if you accidentally choose one of those. The real prompts themselves feel more authentic, since they will often intentionally include spelling mistakes or punctuation errors. And finally, the presentation is just nice. Easily the best of the 3 Drawful titles. Everything is vibrant with great animations, and I gotta give a special shout out to the timer, which is represented as a corgi with hundreds of legs. Porcupede. The last thing to mention, I guess, would be the fact that there's 3 other game modes that, while don't add much, are welcome additions. You of course got your custom prompts where you and your friends can enter anything you like. Nothing wrong with extra content, but custom prompts always seemed odd in the context of Drawful, since assuming you wrote all the prompts beforehand, one of the players will always know what the exact answer is. There's a featured content mode that offers an additional set of prompts created by the team, usually centered around a specific topic. Lastly, there's the friend mode, which is probably the best of the extra modes. All the prompts will include the names of people playing, followed by an action or something about them, such as Jorg's favorite activity, or Dave, dun dun dun, was the murderer all along. Dave! Trying to be objective, I would probably say Drawful 2 is the overall better Drawful, since it's the less flawed experience. But I prefer Animate, since I think the animation angle makes it more fun, for whatever that's worth. If you like the previous Drawful titles, then I'd say Animate is at least worth a shot or 2. Speaking of flawed experiences, the Wheel of Enormous Proportions. This is a hard one to tackle because there are so many great things about Wheel, but those things are unfortunately overshadowed by the problematic foundation the game is built upon. The Wheel of Enormous Proportions, 3 to 8 players with an audience feature, which don't even bother honestly because all the audience can do is just vote for who they think will win, is a trivia game at heart, and the trivia itself is good? Like, really good. Mind you, this is coming from someone who isn't even a huge trivia buff. There's tons of variety in the question formats. Stuff like clicking on which of 12 things are toxic to cats, to rapid firing a bunch of movies asking which of the provided 2 had a higher box office. The best part about the trivia though, and the thing Wheel does better than every single trivia game in all of the Jackbox series, is the consistent speed of the questions. And the reason that's such such a big deal in my eyes is that it makes it harder to cheat. In a game like Trivia Murder Party, you get a pretty long time to answer each question, making it easier for cheaters to look up, magically know the correct answer to every last question start to finish. I try to not play with people like that, but it's impossible to avoid when playing with randos on Discord. But in Wheel, most questions either A, give you so many answers you need to select, you simply wouldn't have time to look it all up, or B, will ask you to rapid fire answers to a set of questions, tallying up who answered the most. There unfortunately are exceptions, like the questions that ask you to enter a response to a single question that you have ample time for. Like this one where it asks, if you were to add up all the cash that comes in a game of Monopoly, how much money would you have? Oh yeah, Bread Butter L. I'm sure you just happen to know the exact number to that Monopoly question was 20,580. Pretty common knowledge after all. So yeah, despite the few exceptions, I do want to give credit where credit is due because the trivia here is very engaging. The amount of points you receive for getting the trivia correct, however, is fairly minimal, and this is the biggest catch of the Wheel of VP, the wheel itself. So here's how it works. Everyone starts a game with 2 slices, and anytime you do well with the trivia, you get more slices. There's also 1 power slice question, which are generally the 1 answer format questions shown earlier of the Monopoly thing, that provides 1 power slice to whoever does the best at that question. After all the trivia has been asked, you move to the wheel itself where you can place your slices on the wheel, and if the wheel lands on your slice, you get points. So in other words, it's big time RNG. Of course, doing well with the trivia means you can place more slices, but even if you do 100% perfectly during the trivia, the most slices you can ever have at one time is 6. Since there are 18 slots, your slices can only ever make up a third of the wheel. Mind you, in that hypothetical absolute best case scenario, because most of the time you won't even be able to cover a quarter of the wheel. Not to mention, you have to share points with anyone else who also placed their slice on the same slot as you. Then there's the power slice, which just seems big time broken. As already mentioned, the trivia to obtain these are generally the easiest to cheat at, and having one means that anytime the spinner lands on any spot, that slot then flips over and becomes your slot. If the spinner lands on that slot again, a short little event plays out where anyone can potentially get points, although it's heavily weighted in the favor of the one person who got the power slice. During the wheel segment, once a player gets over 20,000 points, they get to spin a separate wheel to see if they win. And when I say win, I quite literally mean the entire game. If they land on a skull, the game continues, but that winner wheel becomes easier to win for any preceding player. And if they don't land on a skull, well, then they win and that's game. As you can probably guess, it's the wheel itself where most of the game's issues are derived from. The majority of the game is quite literally dependent on the spin of a wheel, which can be as funny as it is aggravating. I've always loved Jackbox's ability to combine trivia with other elements, but RNG in trivia is a pretty poor combo choice. Trivia Murder Party's minigames are such a good mix of trivia because if you don't know the answer, trivia is RNG. So to balance that out with minigames that generally give you a bit of agency is something that works really well. But here in Wheel, as good as the variety and the pacing of the trivia is, the reality is that you're not going to know everything. So you play through the trivia portion, which is unavoidably going to have a bit of RNG in there unless your name is Google, to the next segment where it's just full on RNG. Ironically, aside from the wheel itself. The wheel of enormous proportions has a lot going for it. Again, the trivia itself is some of the best in the Jackbox franchise. The presentation, and especially the soundtrack and sound design, is just phenomenal as you'd expect from the team. The host is the wheel itself, and although I do see a lot of people complain about him, I think he's fantastic. He has an ego as big as his face and is constantly jovial. Hands down one of the all-time funniest Jackbox hosts.
Are you stunned by my glorious, enormous presence? Don't insult your host, just say yes.
I almost forgot to mention that at the start of the game, you get to type in any question you want. And at the end of the game, the wheel will answer the question of whoever won. Just a quirky little extra. Doesn't have much to do with the game, and it certainly didn't need to be here. But I'm glad it was, because it's always funny to see how the game responds to the player-submitted questions. Wheel isn't a game I often come back to, since if I'm going to play a trivia game, I'm probably just gonna boot up Murder Party. But I definitely want to call this a bad game. The RNG nature of the wheel can be annoying to deal with, but the trivia itself is really well done. This can be a hard one to recommend, but if you really like trivia or bullshit, then there might be something here that will appeal to you. Job Job, easily the most popular game in 8 by a wide margin. Job Job is our fill-in-the-blank Quiplash-esque game of the pack, all about submitting funny answers to work-related questions. 3 to 10 players, again with an audience above the 10,000, are all potential new hires being interviewed by your host/boss, M. Bubbles, who is quite literally just a water cooler with glasses. The game starts by asking you introduction questions such as, what is something you would say in your award acceptance speech? This first part doesn't matter too much as none of it is scored, so just enter whatever you want. want. The real reason these questions are asked is because each individual word of your response will be sent to other players. Each player receives the responses from 3 different people, and from there, you and your friends need to answer the real questions, using only words from the answers to those introduction questions. Well, sort of. You click on any of those torn up words to use in your submission, but you can also click on literally any word on your screen to use in your answer. This includes words from the question you were being asked. So if the game is asking you what you do if Trent won't stop showing you kitten videos, you can click on the name Trent to use in your horribly offensive answer. From there, it takes on the standard Quiplash formula where 2 answers are shown side by side, and you vote for the funniest. You get extra points if any of your words are used in someone else's answer, and extra points if you submit a winning answer that includes words from all 3 players. This goes on for 3 rounds, with the game asking you to type out responses to some filler questions in between rounds, and finally the 3rd and final round having a slightly different format, asking you to submit first impressions. Something like, I love blank, but I hate blank. After that, scores are tallied up, and the player with the highest score gets a job, aka wins the game. If Joke Boat is an example of game restrictions done wrong, then Job is an example of game restrictions done right, because it's restrictive without feeling limiting, if that makes sense. Because sure, you do have a finite pool of words to work with, but between being able to use any text on your screen and in any order you like, you can get pretty creative despite the intentional limitations. Although I do think, for the most part, your enjoyment of the game is going to heavily rely on whether or not you find broken English funny. I think broken English is hilarious, which is why the less direct responses of Job work well for myself and many of my friends. But if broken English is something you maybe find a little mindless, then you'll probably prefer the more coherent responses of Quiplash, and you know, just prefer that game overall as a result. For me, however, I actually prefer Job over Quiplash. Every Quiplash has at least one thing that holds it back in my eyes. For 1 and 2, it's the final round, and for 3, it's the weaker prompts and that carnival music. But in Job, I think nearly everything is done incredibly well. The final round is just as strong as the first 2 rounds, the sound design and music is great, the visuals, while basic, really suit the office environments. I especially love the stock clip art you used to see commonly used in PowerPoint presentations. And dude, 10 players! Every Quiplash has only ever gone up to 8, so even just the additional 2, alongside the audience feature that is just as good as the one in Quiplash, that's huge. The audience can vote on their favorite answers just like in Quiplash, but when players are submitting their answers, the audience gets to make a dumbass motivational poster that gets presented on the wall. The feature is limited, but giving the audience anything to do at all is better than just waiting like they have to do in Quiplash. Although, trying to be fair here, if there's one thing Quiplash does do better, it's pacing. Quiplash 3 in particular is such a fast game. If you're an in-game player, there's very little downtime. In contrast, Job is a bit slower, and of course due to the game's fundamental design, there needs to be twice as many submission rounds. One where you type answers, and a second where you use those typed answers for the actual prompt. But I think that's a small compromise for everything else Job offers. The coolest thing about Job is that I would argue it has the highest effort to comedy ratio out of any party pack inclusion. Games like Talking Points are almost always hilarious once you start playing, but it's not a game you can half-ass. You gotta be full energy, 100% invested if you want to play that game. For old, wrinkly 106-year-old farts like me, it can feel like a huge investment. But in Job, because of the restrictions, you can play that shit half asleep and it's still funny. Not that Job is the absolute funniest Jackbox game, but for the amount of effort required, you're getting a pretty good return. Its format of using other people's initial answers also gives you a good idea of not only what your opponents are okay with, but it can set you up to knowing what they'll likely respond to. Plus, in line of the work team environment, there's a collaborative and funny nature to seeing your dumb words using somebody else's dumb response. Quiplash has always been a longtime staple of the Jackbox Party Pack series, and it's seen a counterpart or imitator in every Jackbox that doesn't include it. But in my opinion, there's only been one imitator to dethrone the OG, and that game is Job. The Pull Mine, essentially being Jackbox's take on Family Feud. Pull Mine sees up to 10 players split into 2 teams of cave dwellers trying to escape this labyrinth of a cavern. The only way out? Well, by being surveyed on a random assortment of topics, of course. Stuff like,
what's the worst response to I love you?
You're provided 8 answers and need to vote for the exact order you want, with your first vote being weighted heavier than your second being weighted heavier than your third, and so on. Once everyone votes, it's discussion time. You have to talk with your team about what everyone voted so you know what options to pick. In round 1, out of everyone playing of course, you want to find the top 3 answers. Round 2, you want the top 4 answers, but not the number 1 pick. In the final round, you need to find the least popular answer. You get a torch anytime your team picks correctly, but lose a torch when your team picks incorrectly. The torches are a pretty ingenious addition as they essentially act act as lives. During the final round, if you have 0 torches when the opposing team picks a correct door, you lose the game. This is on top of the fact that you can only lose torches in the final round, so that last round is an endurance until a team runs out of lives or the final answer is uncovered. Simple game on the surface, but it's deceptively strategic. Said strategy coming from the notion that you want to give the opposing team as little information as possible. So if you start a round off like, alright, my number 1 was this, my number 2 was that, my number 3 and 4 were those, you're only shooting yourself in the foot because you can only vote for 1 answer on your turn. So if you even talk about 2 answers, since you can only vote for 1, the next team up now has all this information on an option that can still be voted for. But despite all the strategy, Coal Mine is a super chill game. The presentation is so cozy. You got this super chill music, a great simplistic art style with choppy but subtle movements. I mean, these character designs and animations are a lot of fun, super inspired, and look like no other Jackbox game. The overall screen is painted with this pleasant blue with a soft green gradient, with just the slightest bit of film grain. But again, the music here really sells it. Seriously, listen to how chill this is. Just a wonderfully presented game. They really nailed it. And that presentation definitely works in the game's favor because Coal Mine is a Jackbox game I'm almost always in the mood to play. Games like Quiplash or Talking Points are very dependent on the people you choose to play with. If you play with randos that don't have the same sense of humor as you, both those games at times can be painful to sit through. But Coal Mine isn't like that. This is a laid-back experience that asks you to calm the down, take a deep breath, and talk it out. This, of course, is the very reason younger players I've seen, at least in my Jackbox server, seem to despise Coal Mine. Since the only thing you ever input is your team name at the very start, there's no room to slip in your memes or references, which is a huge letdown to those who only view Jackbox as a podium for their stand-up. But I like Coal Mine for a similar reason I like Guespionage, and that reason is that it's a great beacon for discussion, not just memes or references. I mean like actual discussion. You genuinely get to know the people you're playing with. People will tell you fibbage enough about you is the same way, but in that game, learning about the other players is at the expense of losing. If you're going to learn something new about someone in the lobby, it's going to be after you already got the answer wrong, still rewarding people who already knew each other. Which, don't get me wrong, I love fibbage about you, but in Coal Mine, no matter how well you think you know someone, there's no way you're going to know all their votes in the exact order they voted for them. However, to make educated assumptions, you'll need to, and that's what makes Coal Mine a great springboard for discussion. My biggest critiques of the game would have to do with some of the prompts themselves. There's some real bad ones in there, and the quality of the 3 prompts in your game can, and likely will, directly impact your enjoyment of Coal Mine. Like this one. If US states were people, which would be the best coworker? What the kind of question is that? There was another one of this nature I got that I unfortunately don't have the footage of. That was something like, if the shape of states were Street Fighter characters, which would be the best fighter? Many of these just have bad answers too. So many great prompts run by extremely questionable choices. Again, I don't have footage of this one, so you're just gonna have to take my word for it. But there was a question that was like, there's a zombie apocalypse. What store are you turning into your base of operations? It was something along those lines. Pretty good question, right? But before I tell you what the choices were, just ask yourself what your top 3 or so are. Pause the video if you need to. Alright, got it? Okay, well, if your answer was a big retail store that has a bunch of food or tools you can use as weapons, you know, stores like Walmart, Target, Costco, or if maybe your mind was leaning more on the offensive side of things, and you were thinking maybe hardware stores like Home Depot, Lowe's, maybe even Sears, well, if you said anything along those lines, none of those were answers. It was stuff like jewelry stores, and I think Bed Bath & Beyond was an option. The one answer I definitely remember being part of the list, since it was somehow the best answer, was Hot Topic. Let me repeat that because I don't think everyone is hearing me. There's a question about where to go during a zombie apocalypse, and Hot Topic was unironically the best provided answer. I think the best way to fix this problem is to just allow the teams to pick the next category between maybe 2 or 3 options. I mean, you vote for everything else, even your team name, so voting for the next category would totally be in line with the rest of the game. Nevertheless, in addition to the main game, there is also the streamer mode. In this mode, all the in-game players are on one team, and all the audience members, up to 10,000, are on another. The in-game team votes for answers the same way they would normally vote for things in this game, talking about it and then making an educated decision. The audience, on the other hand, which is represented by hundreds of spiders, votes in a more hive mind fashion, with the highest voted on answer among all audience members being what they choose. A cool idea for a mode, but the problem with it should be obvious for anyone who thinks about it for even a second. Since the audience also votes on their choices before the round, ultimately determining the ranking of the options, all they have to do is just vote for exactly the same things again. If the game is asking you to find the top 3 answers, all you have to do is just vote for the same exact thing you voted for in the first place that determined the final ranking, as long as you never change your votes. The hive mind will get it right every single time. Same goes for the final round, except just in reverse order. The only time it's ever any more complicated is during the second round, where you want answers 2, 3, and 4, which the audience group seems to unavoidably vote number 1 on every single time, which is the other problem of this mode. Since it is built on mob mentality, there's no discussion to be had. If you're playing with hundreds of others, your voice is just gonna get drowned out in the chat. And as the in-game player, there's no other information to go off of other than the information of your team. Listening in on the opposing team's rationality is half of what makes Pull Mine the game that it is. To more or less remove that element entirely strips a lot away from this game. Also, can we just talk about the achievements, or specifically one in particular? Anyone who's ever looked at Jackbox 8's achievements already knows exactly where I'm going with this. Every Jackbox game has achievements, which I don't bother to mention because it really isn't relevant to the review. But what is this versus the world achievement? In streamer mode, play against an audience of 1,000 or more. What? Jackbox streams occasionally on their official YouTube channel, and rarely ever do they break 100. And if the creators of the game can't get the achievements, then who are they expecting will? Even 100 would be insane. But if it was 100, at least smaller streamers and personalities would have a chance at getting it. But 1,000? If you know anyone with this achievement, unless you're friends with a huge streamer, live with the knowledge that they 100% used a third-party program to cheat that achievement in. All that aside, Pull Mine is still a fantastic game. The slower, more methodical nature of this game understandably won't be for everyone. If none of what I talked about sounds like your kind of thing, it likely won't be. But if to you, humor is not a requirement for a good Jackbox game, and you do value games that encourage discussion and critical thinking, Pull Mine is an overlooked gem I can't recommend enough. Lastly, we have Weapons Drawn. And oh boy, are you guys ready for this one? Because this is easily the most complicated Jackbox game in just the rules alone. In fact, I didn't even fully understand this game until writing this review, so buckle up. So, Weapons Drawn is a drawing/social deduction game where you play the role of both detectives and murderers. The game starts by asking you to draw 2 weapons and to hide a letter in each. This letter is your calling card and will always be a letter pulled from your current username. You want to hide that letter because when you kill an accomplice later on, it will show the weapon that was used to kill said accomplice. And if players can spot a letter that was used in your name, they're gonna know you're the one who did it. As you can probably guess, certain letters like an L or an O are much easier to hide than others, putting certain players at a pretty decent disadvantage. Like, yeah, good luck hiding that G. If there's any game that should let you change your username when joining, it should have been Weapons Drawn. Because if you have a shorter username that's only a couple of letters long, it makes it incredibly easy for others to narrow down which letter could have been your calling card. For example, I usually use the username Jorg when playing Jackbox, but that's a really bad username for the purposes of this game. First of all, it's only 4 letters, so that already narrows it down quite a bit. But on top of that, the letters J, R, and G are already some of the harder letters to hide. And on top of that, the letters J and G are not letters commonly used in most other usernames. So if my calling card is the letter J, people will immediately know it's me if they see a J. Whereas if it was something like an A, that could belong to any number of players that also have the letter A in their username. It's weird you can't change your name in the lobby, and it's even stranger that, to my knowledge, the game doesn't even tell you that calling cards are always letters taken from your username. Regardless, be cautious of what your username is going in. Of course, that's given the assumption you're not going to cheese the system, because much to Weapons Drawn's detriment, there are so many ways to be exploitative. Firstly, if you know your calling card is going to be one of the letters in your username, you can make your username a scrambled mess of like half the alphabet, which, yes, is something I have seen people do. Then there's the fact that, sure, the game will tell you what to draw, but that's really just a guideline more than anything because there is nothing stopping you from drawing whatever you want. And there's no score incentive to make players want to draw what they're being told to draw. The game telling you to draw bubbles and your calling card is the letter W? Well, that might be hard to pull off, so f it. Just draw a spike bit instead. But hey, why stop there? You can just draw every letter in the alphabet so people can't tell which one is the game provided one. But hey, why even stop there? Why don't you just scribble all over your screen? I mean, sure, the letter will draw on top of your other lines, but there's always ways to get around that as well. Like abusing the fact that lines can still merge with your letter, or the fact that the last line you drew will always draw on top of everything. So you can still draw attention away from your letter by drawing a bunch of lines that are layered above everything else. And sometimes you don't even have to be the dangerously cheesy one. The game will make it easy for you. Like, check this out. This turtle was drawn by me, right? My calling card was a lowercase n, but the game separated the stem from the top of the N from the rest of the letter. So if anything, it looks like a U placed over an organic line. I like the idea of hiding a calling card in your art. I really do. It's a really cool idea. But because of how easy it is to cheese the system, the feature becomes a non-factor. I think it could have been remedied by maybe limiting the number of lines you can draw alongside the length of them. But regardless, because of all that, the biggest giveaway to telling who drew what is just their art style flat out. This, beyond everything else I have already mentioned with weapons drawn, is my biggest issue of the game. I'm by no means a great artist, but much like many other artists, I do have a distinct art style. If people can tell that I, or whoever else, is the person that drew something, then what does hiding the calling card even matter? So much like a game like Bidiots, we once again have a drawing game where you are rewarded for vague and sloppy art. Unironically, the best strategy of this game is to draw super shitty with lines and objects unrelated to your prompt basically everywhere. Anyways, yes, at the start of the game you're asked to draw 2 weapons, the first of which will be used as a reference the game will let others know you drew, and the second drawing will be your first murder weapon. So if you've been following so far, yes, it's unironically in your best interest to make the art style of your first weapon look completely different than every other weapon you'll be drawing for the rest of the game so that people have a harder time identifying your art style. After that, you name your accomplice that will likely be murdered, but you don't want them to be. So whatever you type in, make sure people can't tie the name back to you. Hell, do your best to enter the most generic, not you sounding thing ever. Because after those accomplices are named and introduced, you have to systematically click on the name of an accomplice, and then who you think the creator of said accomplice is. You keep doing this until you successfully match up the name of an accomplice to their creator, hence murdering said accomplice, or until enough accomplices have been murdered by other players. If you kill an accomplice, your murder weapon will appear on the screen alongside the weapons of all the other murderers. From there, it's now time for everyone to find out who drew what weapon. Players vote on which drawing they want to investigate. A random player is given a magnifying glass so they can, I guess, zoom into the picture to be like, oh, there it is, the letter Z. But I have yet to play a game where the feature actually helped out. All the drawings on the right are supposed to be there so you can match a calling card. But as explained earlier, it's most helpful in the fact that it allows you to match an art style. 2 things super important to know that the game does not bother telling you. 1. The murderer cannot be the current player holding the magnifying glass. Why it still lets you vote for that player regardless only further complicates the experience. It makes things less intuitive. 2. The murderer cannot be a player whose weapon on the right is the same as the one on the left. That's why the drawings are color-coded, so you know not to vote for a player that has the same color drawing on the right as the weapon on the left. Why the game doesn't tell you any of this is beyond me. Furthermore, why it still lets you vote for those players regardless only further complicates the experience and makes things less intuitive. If these answers are just inherently wrong because of how the game works, and that is a rule in the game the player should learn, then just gray them out. Don't let people vote for them. So everyone votes on who they think drew the murder weapon. The victim is declared either guilty or not guilty. Do that with a few more drawings and then move on to round 2, which is entirely the same as round 1, with the biggest difference being that now you have to hide cursive letters. From my experience, a lot of people don't know cursive. They taught it when I was in school, but if randos I often play with are any indication, they don't teach it anymore, meaning you could have a lot of these letters dead center of the screen and people still wouldn't know what calling card it was. Go through a second round of that and then move on to the final segment of the game, the cold cases, which is a rapid fire arrangement of all the unsolved murders, letting you know who drew what, regardless if people vote correctly here or not. After that, the game lets you know who is the best detective, murderer, and accomplice, and an overall winner is declared. There have been other Jackbox games that are a bit incomprehensive on an initial playthrough, Bidiots and Push a Button being prime examples. But for those, at least after just 2 or 3 playthroughs, you'll fully understand them. Whereas Weapons Drawn, I played this game countless times, and only now do I fully understand how all the mechanics work because I went out of my way to really study them. Unfortunately, the thing about Weapons Drawn is that its complications are all surface level. Once you learn the game, there really isn't a whole lot going on, which, yeah, I'd say is a problem. Because for a game that takes longer to learn than most other Jackbox titles, you'd hope there would also be more depth to complement it, but there really isn't. Not only does it take longer to learn though, it also takes longer to play. Weapons Drawn is a long game. Half an hour long, in fact. Transitions are slow and timers are long. I can't imagine playing more than 1 session of this at a time. Weapons Drawn does have a decent amount going for it. The game looks super classy with a regal soundtrack to boot. The sound design and particularly the narration is great. And ultimately, this is just a really creative idea for a game. One of the team's most interesting concepts for sure. All that being said, as great as those things are, it just doesn't make up for the slow pacing, the steep learning curve, the shallow depth, and a system that is far too easy to cheese. This is definitely a game where you have to make sure everyone is playing it the right way, which in my opinion, you shouldn't have to do. Maybe it's just me, but it feels bad when you know the best strategy in a game and have to purposely handicap yourself from using it so the the game can even be a game. I know this game has its fans, and please, don't let me prevent you from enjoying it. If you like Weapons Drawn, please continue to like it. But for me, Weapons Drawn is a case best left closed. Bitter note to end on, but that's Pack 8. In comparison to its predecessor, Pack 7, Jackbox 8 takes a lot of risk. And while not all of those risks pay off like what we saw with Weapons Drawn, a lot of them do, such as what we saw with Pull Mine. Pack 8 is a hard pack to recommend because seemingly every game in this pack tends to get mixed reception. Even Job. I know plenty of people who don't care much for it and prefer Quiplash. Plus, 2 drawing games in a single pack make for a collection of games that is perhaps lacking in variety. But despite all of that, Pack 8 is still my second most played Jackbox at over 80 hours thanks to Pull Mine and Job. And I even find myself playing Drawful Animate from time to time. Packs like 6 and 8 are hard to recommend because, as a package, you're not really getting a bang for your buck, but solely judging it on the merit of its individual entries. Pack 8 has, in my eyes, 2 of the best in the series. The Jackbox Party Pack 8 gets a 4 out of 5. Pack 8 is one I see get a fair amount of slander thrown at, but the games here that are good are really good. In addition, this is a pack I load up a lot due to 3 of these games having that 10-player cap. Despite Pack 7 being the Jackbox I recommend to people, 8 is the one I play more often, and that's gotta count for something. If you already own Packs 3 and 7 and want some games of a more unconventional spin, Jackbox 8 is a pack I wholeheartedly recommend. Hey, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a shout out to patrons such as Ronnie Batter, Albium, Amanda Guth, Awesome Games, David Marchesi, David Pacheco, Drew Kellenberger, Gameplayer 1500, Ian, Kinzel TN, Penchester, Victorian Mars, and some crazy idiot. Again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for sticking with me for this entire Jackbox review series, and until 10 comes out, have a good one.